back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. My name is Brendan Cole. Eleven EU countries have drawn up a plan it says will strengthen the 27-nation bloc. The so-called Future of Europe group, which does not include the UK, says the European Commission, the EU's executive arm, must be stronger and its head could be directly elected. The bloc also demanded a new defence policy under the control of a new pan-EU foreign ministry, and also mooted is the possibility of a European army. The German-led grouping also demanded an end to existing national vetoes over foreign and defence policy. This could give the EU the power to impose a decision on Britain if it is supported by a majority. José Manuel Barroso, President of the European Commission, gave his annual State of the Union address and spoke of a future federation of nation-states. The plan is likely to fuel calls for a British referendum on membership of the European Union. And in the midst of a euro crisis, does this report strengthen the case for a federal Europe? Should there be a referendum on Britain's membership in the EU, or is the European project a threat to national sovereignty? Well, to discuss this, I'm joined by Stephen Haseler. He's director of the Global Policy Institute. Also here in the studio is Timothy Congdon. He's the economic spokesperson for the UK Independence Party. On the line, we have Andrew Duff. He's a Liberal Democrat MEP and president of the Union of European Federalists. And also on the line is Chris Clarke, former Goldman Sachs executive director, hedge fund manager, and he also has a blog on the global economy called economicperil.com. Thank you very much for joining me, gentlemen, here at the Voice of Russia. I'll start with the announcement of the Future of Europe group. It made the point that the Eurozone crisis has caused a crisis of confidence. So closer integration is inevitable, isn't it, Timothy Congdon?
Certainly not. You see at the moment tensions between, for example, the German Constitutional Court and the European Commission. So even the Germans, who are supposed to be the drivers of this process of integration, have their reservations. But there's clearly in Britain growing worries and fears about what's happening to our sovereignty. And in my view, Britain will in due course leave the European Union.
Do you see it that way, Stephen Haseler?
No, I don't. It seems to me inevitable that this global financial banking crisis has to have a response, and the only way we can be saved from the ravages it's about to inflict on Western peoples is through an integrated Europe, all in it together, a united Europe, one in which we don't fight each other, therefore allowing arbitrage and people to divide us. It's the only hope for our future as a stable democracies in Western Europe. And Britain, in my view, although we will have a lot of difficulty in joining this because of our what I think is our stubborn insistence to an outdated notion of sovereignty. Nonetheless, I think that the opportunity is there now, because a big debate is underway, for Britain to get involved and to start to cooperating with our friends to bring about a more integrated Europe is there. So I think this is a huge opportunity for Europe to unite. If we don't, we're going to squabble and we're going to be divided in a global economy that's extremely dangerous.
Chris Clarke, does Britain have an outdated notion of sovereignty?
No, I think I don't agree at all. No, I think the thing that seems to have come to people's attention is that every country in Europe has a very strong sense of sovereignty, and the vast majority of the people in Europe would like to keep that sovereignty. Unfortunately, unelected officials above them seem to be heading towards more and more convergence. It's not what the people of Europe want. It certainly isn't what the people of the UK want, and at some point the madness has to stop.
Andrew Duff, Liberal Democrat MEP, you wrote with regard to the José Barroso speech that he had done well to drop his former inhibitions about the F word, and that the call for Europe to follow a federal path is absolutely right. Why is that?
Yes. Well, I think that for too long people have failed to speak the truth about the scale and scope of integration. I also believe that if we're to salvage the euro and to save the single market, then there must be greater fiscal integration. And if you do that, it's not easy, it's not quick, and it's not straightforward, and there are problems inside the domestic politics of all member states. But if you are going to do that, which I think we are, then you have to run the fiscal union through a federal economic government. It's important to understand that and to stimulate a serious political debate on the matter, free of taboos about national sovereignty, which is, in present globalized circumstances, an archaic notion.
There are strong economic arguments, aren't there, Tim Congdon, that should there be a closer link financially and closer fiscal policy within the EU, the arguments are pretty convincing, aren't they?
Certainly not. Can I just say, in terms of this idea of Andrew Duff says doesn't believe in a unified state, he certainly believes, if he follows what Barroso has said, in a federation of nation states with the central government in Brussels. That clearly is so. Whether you want to call that unified state or not is a semantic matter. It would mean the end of Britain as a separate nation. Let's be clear about that. He then uses this fantastic phrase, taboos about national sovereignty. Let's be clear. There are 160 countries in the world that do not belong to the European Union, and they're fine. Canada, Australia, and so on are sovereign, independent nations, and I think they're very pleased to say that way. I wish we were too.
Well, Stephen Haseler, what do you make of that?
Well, on the question of sovereignty, the world has moved on from what we used to call the Westphalian system of individual nation states now with any power. They do exist, but they don't have any power. The kind of state that Tim is talking about is really lost in this world. The point I'm trying to make is if you look at the real economics of our globe, the banking system, the financial system has been integrated. It is global, whereas politics is, to some extent, still thought of in national terms, and therefore bankers can roll over national economies anytime they want. So the only way we can restore democracy to the economic system, in my view, is to give the political side of things more power and more influence. And that, I think, has to be done through big new nation states or things that approximate to those that are also democratic, like the United States. The United States has huge advantages in the world economy because it is a large continent state, a federal state, and Europe, although it's not going to go down that route directly, obviously, Andrew's right about that, nonetheless we are going to be having more and more of the types of relationship with the international system that countries like the United States have. If we don't, we're all sunk, that's my point. We'll be divided up. Each nation state will lose its power. Tim's very much in favour of nation states having power. They don't in the present global system. They can only get power and influence over their lives by combining. And we have this fantastic European Union here, which we should use to do that.
Well, perhaps the argument should shift. Perhaps a better approach would be to look at a narrower set of functions where there should be more integration, Tim Congdon, perhaps such as joint bonds or a coherent banking union.
Let's just be clear that in the modern world, small states flourish and survive and do very well. Can I just say examples, Singapore, United Arab Emirates, they had much faster economic growth than any nation in the European Union in the last 10 or 20 years. They do fine. They are sovereign and independent, and that benefits them. We do not need to be part of the European Union. We have to live in a world where it remains true that even very small nations can flourish and do well. Britain is, in fact, a substantial power with important trade links and so on. We do not need to be part of the European Union to flourish.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. We're discussing European federalism with Stephen Haseler, Director of the Global Policy Institute, Tim Congdon, Economic Spokesperson for the UK Independence Party, Andrew Duff, Liberal Democrat MEP and President of the Union of European Federalists, and Chris Clarke, former Goldman Sachs Executive Director and founder of the blog economicperil.com.
In terms of the specific question about banking union and so on, well, I'll believe this when we see our neighbours put together the proposed stability mechanism that's now meant to shore up the Eurozone. The truth is that Finland, Germany and so on have just had a big squabble with Spain about this matter. If they can't put that together, I suggest we should stay outside, as we very sensibly have stayed outside the European single currency.
Chris Clarke, speaking of the Eurozone and the Eurozone crisis, I guess we're seeing the European Central Bank, European Banking Authority, transforming into having more supervisory powers. So should there be a new Treasury facility? Should there be a new way of looking at dealing with this crisis in a more federal way?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I think that the 2 points are... I mean, I'd like to just go back on what the other guests have said and just raise 2 points, which will come on to this point. And it is that when I look back at the 20th century, the one lesson I believe human beings should have learned from all that happened in that 100-year period is that large federalist states cause pain, anguish, starvation, death and misery to the man on the street. That's what we learn. The second point, which I think is also extremely valid, and that is that there is a limited amount of economic growth available on this planet going forward. It's a zero-sum game. The world does not have the resources for every country and every, set of federalist areas on the planet to grow going forward. Growth is shifting east to China, to Singapore, to these countries. The only way that Europe will compete going forward is not by creating false jobs and pretending it's had economic growth like it has done for the last 10 years, where it's all about over-borrowing and government spending. The only way it will compete going forward is to be competitive in international markets. And the only way it will do that is to decentralize, to deregulate, to become far more business-minded, entrepreneurial, less bureaucratic. And it is doing, at the moment, the exact opposite.
Stephen Haseler, your response to that?
We've just seen, on that market point, we've just seen the collapse of international markets. This whole Eurozone crisis, the American financial crisis, the global financial crisis, is the result of the collapse of private sector banking, because it was not regulated properly. And the only way private sector banking, with its huge credit explosion, which has caused the Eurozone crisis, it's not the European governments that have caused this, it's the banking crisis with the unemployment leading to these governments having to engage in more social spending than maybe they should have done otherwise. This whole crisis is caused by markets, unregulated markets. And the only way in which you can regulate markets, in my view, in a global system is through more increasing federal governments. So let's be clear what the origin of this problem is. It is banks, it is the private sector having got completely out of control in the 10 years before 2008. The crash of that financial crisis, of that financial system, has now led to governments scrabbling around to try and be able to feed and give social security systems to their peoples, and therefore having to rely now on European support. So let's get this crisis right. What started it? The problem was these unregulated markets started it, and we should never forget that in this present debate, even though the neoliberals, still in considerable positions of power, still seem not to be able to grapple with that central truth.
Tim Congdon from UKIP. Already what we're seeing is the euro crisis being dealt with at a supranational level. It's the horse is already bolted. We can't go back to the UK pulling out of the EU, can we?
Let's just come back to what Mr. Haseler has just said. There is indeed a crisis in Europe, specifically in the Eurozone, which was put together by the governments concerned. To be clear about that, this was done by the governments, in many cases, by the way, against the opposition of the people. There is a two-speed Europe. I was told 15 years ago, if you didn't join me, we'll be going to slow coaches. Other way around. Slow coaches are those countries inside the inside the single European single currency. They are failing very badly relative to the countries outside, which include ourselves. We're not doing so badly. Eastern Europe and Sweden. The Eurozone has been a disaster. It was put together by governments, not by the private banking system at all.
Andrew Duff, Liberal Democrat MEP. There is a strong case. UKIP's fundamental case have ties with Europe, have trade with Europe, but we don't need to be in the European Union, and that's a pretty strong case at what we're seeing now with the euro crisis, isn't it?
Well, I don't think it is. The British economy is in crisis, and that, I wonder just who Tim is going to blame for all of that. We cannot blame Brussels or Frankfurt for the critical state of Britain. If Britain cuts itself from the single market, which is the prospect that's postulated by UKIP, we will be in frightful trouble. I think also that UKIPers ought to travel more. They ought to travel to Washington and to Beijing and Delhi and indeed Moscow to ask what the global perspective is on this increasing British isolationism. The answer is that it is simply not comprehended. The Americans and Russians and Chinese will appreciate a Europe that is strong and growing and confident, with a clearer form of governance, so that the Union can be a more respectable partner in global affairs.
Some of the other things that were brought up by the Future of Europe group and creation of a European border police, and also what was mooted was a European army. And I'd like to get your views on this, Tim Congdon. In a way, they're kind of practical measures that seem to ease red tape. Those won't encroach on sovereignty, will they?
Well, there already is free movement of people in the European Union, which in some ways is a wonderful thing. I think free movement of people to work elsewhere is something which should be looked at more carefully. But the question of the European army, let's just be clear that Britain has an independent nuclear deterrent. We are on the Security Council of the United Nations. We have these things partly for historical reasons. I think the British people need to understand that one of the driving forces behind European integration in the last 50 years has indeed been a wish on the part of important elements in the French and German elites, in effect, to rectify the result of the Second World War. People in this country will not tolerate that.
Stephen Haseler, I mean, the talk of the European army, this for starters, this will come into direct conflict with NATO, won't it? I mean, this isn't going to work.
Well, look, Europe has certain interests in the world which are different from that of the United States. We have some which are similar. But the future of Europe has to be increasingly that we look to our own defence in this world. Of course we do. This is a changing world. It's not based on old-fashioned kings and queens and countries independent in Victorian time. Nothing like that at all. It's a very dangerous world. The Americans increasingly are looking towards Asia as their future centre of gravity. And the Europeans, although we'll continue to relate to the United States and to NATO, nonetheless must start moving now to think about our own interests in the world. And by the way, Britain's interests are largely linked up, of course, with the interests of Germany and France. We're neighbours, we share a continent together, we do have similar interests in the world. So I think this move towards a greater foreign policy and greater defence, it will be uneven, but it's quite reasonable and quite rational.
But then again, I mean, you're going to have a duplication of effort, isn't there? I mean, allies will have to conduct force planning and make decisions twice, once at a NATO level, once at an EU level. This is going to discriminate against NATO members who are not EU members.
That assumes that the future of our defence system is NATO-based forever. It isn't. The Cold War's over, folks. This is another point. NATO is a Cold War organisation led by the United States in which we were told what to do, basically, by the United States. If you look at Iraq, our invasion of Iraq, Britain did invade Iraq, you know, at the behest of the United States. This kind of world is now over. The Americans are pulling back, they're concentrating now on Asia, and we in Europe are left, increasingly, not immediately, can be left alone to decide our own destiny. So we have to talk about defence. We have to talk about European armies. It'll be difficult, particularly because the British, their imperial past, the elites here, Tim talks about French and German elites. The elites here are still fixated on an imperial past in which they think Britain rules the waves. Look at our defence budget, by the way. The Tory government here are having to cut our defence budget. We're not going to be able to defend ourselves on our own in the future. We're going to need to cooperate with our nearest allies. And and these people are allies. France and Germany are allies, no matter what UKIP might say. They're allies of ours. Democratic countries who are allies of us, we have to cooperate with them in terms of geopolitics and defence.
Chris Clarke, can I get your reaction to that? I mean, is there a way for a NATO and European army to coexist, given that, well, the role of NATO may change in the generations to come?
To be honest with you, I don't really have a very strong view on it. What I do have a very strong view on is the fact I believe you will see a military overthrow in Europe within the next 3 months. And I think you will see at least 1 to 2 more military overthrows in Europe in the next 18 months, because when you enforce upon a nation what that nation do not want, then you get social unrest. And that is the biggest danger in Europe at the moment. We are seeing the signs of it all over Europe. The warning signs are flashing. I certainly don't think that Greece will last in its present state for much more than a few more months.
Look, I'll put that to Tim Congdon. I mean, do you see it in those terms?
I think that's a bit lurid, a bit exaggerated, but let's just be clear what has happened in the last few days, that there is trouble in Spain. The Catalonia, there's a majority of people do want certainly fiscal autonomy, possibly independence from Spain. And I'm afraid you have had retired generals in Spain, I think, in fact, somebody in the European Parliament from Spain, saying they should send the tanks in. For heaven's sake, you know, one would have thought that Spain had grown out outgrown this sort of thing.
That's complete nonsense. The longer-term crafting of the federal settlement of the EU is not to be done by them, but it's going to go through a rigorous process of a convention, probably starting in the spring of 2015, that will sift out all simplistic and eccentric ideas and will end up with a quality product that Britain can, at that stage, choose to be a part of or not. Secondly, the idea that the social and political disquiet in Spain or Greece or indeed anywhere else is to trigger military coup from the army in these states is complete nonsense. The European Union is profoundly democratic and it's liberal.
Absolutely true. There is no doubt whatever what I said was true. It's not nonsense. It is true that the retired generals, admittedly, the retired generals in Spain have said send their tanks into Catalonia. That is true.
We're bound to see it at this stage in the crisis until the Germans have finally decided to move properly and to organise things. There's still a big political debate in Germany about the way forward in Europe. But we're bound to see fisciparious tendencies for a bit, in my view. We're going to see them, Tim, I'm afraid, in the beloved United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. I think I might remind you that Scotland has a referendum coming up on its own future, which is, in a way, more advanced in terms of its thinking even than Catalonia.
And so we're tanks, and I can assure you, they're welcome to independence if they want it.
The beloved sovereign United Kingdom is also facing these fisciparious tendencies. Now, of course that's going to be the case. But the case for European integration is that the only way we can maintain stability in Europe is by increasing integration and by a political and democratic control of that integrative process. It reinforces the case, in my view.
But in terms of the political argument for it, this has come at a bad time, certainly for the coalition, hasn't it? Because this is going to go up until the 2015 election. This is going to be an issue at the ballot box, isn't it? And there's not really a stomach, there's not really an appetite amongst the British public to debate this.
Tim and I may agree on this. The coalition have been putting off, as all British elites have, a decision on Britain's relationship with Europe. They've been putting it off for years because they can't, by the way, face the consequences at the moment of UKIP's policy of pulling us out of the single market. Now, that is a major change. A major change.
That's not their policy, to be fair.
It's a referendum on pulling out of the EU.
But maintaining economic and trade ties with the European Union.
But the single market, the single market is a central component of the European Union.
But Norway and Switzerland have strong relationships with the EU without being in the EU.
Well, you can say they can have strong relationships, but the destabilising, I want to put this to Tim actually, the destabilising effect of Britain, a member of the European Union, saying it wants to come out of the EU and out of the single market and form a new relationship would be so destabilising at this moment in the fragile British economy as to lead to a major run on sterling, an emergency government in this country, and the real problems that many of these people face.
Can I put that through? Chris Clarke, can I put your reaction to that? What do you make of that?
I think the financial markets would buy the pound, would buy the FTSE 100, would buy any British asset. They would flood to British assets if we got ourselves completely out of this European mess. Let me tell you, I am a participant in the global financial markets. I know how people think. I work with them every day. People would love to have the ability to see us completely stand aside from what is going to fail and what is one of the biggest messes in financial history, and to just get out there on our own. And I personally, we would be buying, the pound would rally, everything British would rally.
I mean, forgive me for not accepting financial advice from market economists.
I'm not a market economist.
After what has happened in the global financial system, caused by market deregulation.
I never got a chance just to briefly put the point, if I can put the point on what I thought happened in the global financial markets, because I do agree on some levels with what's been said about the ability of our government and Gordon Brown to actually regulate and do their job properly and regulate the market. But the global financial meltdown was instilled in 1999 when the US Fed and the European central banks started to manipulate and involve themselves in free markets, which is what you're seeing to the nth degree now. And when you do that, you get meltdowns. And now what we're seeing in Europe is that on a grand scale. They will melt down. This will end in a mess.
Well, I think there's a lot of wishful thinking in Britain, of course, about the European situation ending in a mess. You can see it every day in the Daily Telegraph. They want it to happen, and the reason they want it to happen.
Why don't we give the people in this country a chance to vote for what they want?
Of course, I'm in favour of that.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Brendan Cole. We're discussing, will there be a European superstate, with Stephen Haseler, Timothy Congdon, Andrew Duff, and Chris Clarke. I'll turn to Tim Congdon from UKIP. Isn't the problem with parties like UKIP is that you are seen at a European level as being nationalist or EU? I mean, obviously EU skeptic, but it's a tough sell to make your case to the British public.
Well, I think we're doing quite well at the moment. Can I just make clear that we want to be friendly with our neighbours and we wish them well. And although I think the Eurozone has been a catastrophe, I do hope that somehow they manage to put themselves together again. There are about 190 countries in the world. Most of them do not belong to the European Union. Most of them are flourishing. They also have democracies, most of them. We can become like any of these other countries outside the EU. I could hardly believe something Andrew Duff was saying. The truth is, around the world, the Eurozone, and I'm afraid the European Union as a whole, are regarded as mistakes. International investors do not want to put their money in Europe today because they know it's overregulated, overtaxed, and the economy is stagnant. I'm afraid that the Eurozone in particular is a rapidly declining share of the world economy. We should look to the wider world. We are not little Englanders. We want to be part of a global world of free trading and so on. 60
million people in this country cannot become like Singapore. We are a very different proposition to Singapore and all these tax havens that the UKIP position likes. Britain cannot be. Britain can. They want Britain to become a super tax haven in the world. Basically, that's their future. Now, let me just say
nothing in our party programme.
Of course, there's nothing in the programme like that. But if you look at the emphasis the neoliberals put into the City of London, building up the City of London over the last 30 years, one of the reasons for our economic problems at the moment in Britain, the overselling of the City of London, the fragile nature of the City of London, this is basically a major tax haven. That's the way they look at it. And they want... there are advantages to tax havens. We can get a lot of quick money into this country. But we have 60 million people in this country, and it cannot be run like an offshore tax haven. And if UKIP and people like that want to go down the route of turning this country into an offshore tax haven, they better put that proposition to the British people.
Sadly, we've run out of time. We'll have to leave it there, gentlemen. But I'd just like to finish by thanking my guests. Stephen Haseler, Director of the Global Policy Institute. Tim Congdon, Economic Spokesperson for the UK Independence Party. On the line, Andrew Duff, Liberal Democrat MP and President of the Union of European Federalists. And Chris Clarke, former Goldman Sachs Executive Director.